So let's continue talking about high context and low context cultures. And at this time, let's take a look into the impact that these two cultures may have in the workplace and, of course, in a business setting. Well, if you take a look at this picture, chances are you might experience this in the future. Thing is, most organizations right now adopt people, workforce members or employees coming from different cultures, not necessarily coming from our country only, but even people outside the country to get their expertise, to learn from them, and most especially lead them or let them perhaps lead the organization to create innovations. But the thing is, when you belong to a workplace which is multicultural like this one, there's a possibility that misunderstandings may happen, especially if people that belong to high context and low context cultures interact with each other and are not familiar with how they're supposed to communicate with each other in different aspects. Well, let's talk about that at this point, especially if we talk about the impact of high context and low context cultures, especially at the workplace or in a business transaction. When it comes to decision-making process, these two are different from each other. I mean, I'm referring to people coming from these cultures differ from each other when it comes to making a decision. People from high context cultures have to get first the consensus of everyone. That means all people in the organization should be consulted first, especially if you plan to create or innovate something in your department, or perhaps to initiate something that would change certain areas like policies or standard operating procedures when it comes to using specific equipment in the office. You have to ask for the advice of people, not only people from your level, but most importantly, people that are higher than you. And when it comes to meetings, by the way, and for the fact that meetings really require decisions to be made, meetings that, well, involve a lot of people coming from high context cultures may come out to be vague or unstructured. That means anything can happen. You have to go with the flow, in other words. So that's totally different, especially if you're caught in a company or organization where people communicate, and their communication is that one that belongs to a high context culture. It's different when it comes to people from the low context cultures or culture because they want to make fast and clear decisions as much as possible. For them, time is gold. And that's why they want to focus on actions, and they want to be concise as much as possible when it comes to coming up, achieving, or arriving at certain resolutions or solutions to problems. Well, that's the case when it comes to people who communicate with you and they come from low context cultures. When it comes to conflict resolution, you can also see a big difference between people who communicate and they belong to these two different cultures. If you talk about high context cultures, people coming from this culture, from this group, tend to avoid confrontation. They're non-confrontational, by the way. So if someone from a low context culture expects direct confrontation, well, he or she may be frustrated at the end because the thing is, people who are from high context cultures do not resolve problems immediately in your face. Compared with people from low context cultures, when they want to resolve conflicts, they have what they call conflict management or confrontational management. They want to resolve the conflict immediately, and they do it openly and directly. So, for example, if an American employee perhaps has a problem or concern with you, and you happen to be part of a high context culture, somehow you may find his straightforwardness to resolve that conflict with you or concern that he has with you quite too frank or too intimidating. That's why both of you should meet halfway. There should be a solution for that too. Now, this approach may be considered as aggressive or disrespectful, but the thing is, this is how people from low context cultures communicate with each other and with people from high context cultures. On the aspect of negotiation, negotiations are based on building trust over time. I mentioned this in a separate lecture, especially if you communicate with people coming from high context cultures. And negotiators from this group, by the way, may avoid saying no directly. They would give you subtle signs or gestures or behavioral cues or clues, and you have to figure this out. And once you get the hang of it, then you know exactly if that person gives a yes or a no. For instance, in our culture, uh, for us people, Filipinos, since we belong to the high context culture group, in most of the time, we have a hard time saying no, but we show it through facial expression, through the eyes. Even even a silence may not necessarily mean yes. It could even mean no, or perhaps can you give me time to think this over before I give my response? That's usually the case. People from low context cultures, by the way, if you talk about negotiators coming from this group, often focus on the details and specifics of the deal rather than investing on relationships. So for them, whether they have been negotiating with you for a long time or for a short time, what matters to them is they have to nail down first the agreement. Are the stipulations on the contract agreed by both parties? And do they approve also of the details based on the stipulations or the ones being stipulated on the contract? And low context cultures, by the way, they value efficiency and transparency when it comes to negotiating with you, which can be, well, misinterpreted by people like us from high context cultures as quite impersonal or quite, you know, uh, too frank, too fast, too abrupt. And they may find it like, hey, this is too fast. Can you slow down? So, well, that's the case when it comes to negotiating with people coming from this culture. Last but not least, when you talk about hierarchy and team dynamics, when you belong to an organization where people come from a high context culture, social hierarchy plays a critical role when it comes to interactions. You have to be careful as to how you're going to treat and show respect to people who are of your level or maybe lower than you or maybe higher than you in terms of rank. And employees may not feel comfortable voicing their opinions openly in group settings, especially if group settings comprise of people with different ranks or of different ranks rather. So those who are new to the organization tend to be silent and they tend to keep their opinions. They tend to not voice out their thoughts or ideas or suggestions or recommendations or opinions to the rest of the team or to the people who are part of the assembly. Now, when it comes to low context cultures, there's what we call an egalitarian approach. Egalitarian means equal. So whether you're the supervisor or just, a rank and file employee, or maybe a manager, or you're part of the mid management, all of you are equal. So whoever gives a suggestion and is taken note of and is appreciated, and that person is given appreciation and perhaps even a reward, even if that person happens to belong to a different rank. So an egalitarian organization values equality as much as possible. Employees from low context cultures are usually encouraged to share their thoughts and opinions freely. And in this case, well, it can be looked or probably be frowned on by people from high context cultures because, well, they don't like the idea of people who are lower than them giving off suggestions or opinions. So it's always the opinion or opinions or suggestions or ideas of those who are higher in rank that should be taken note of or should be highly considered. It's a different case to people belonging to, low context cultures. Now, when it comes to business, let's take a look at examples of people from other countries on how they actually interact and transact in a business setting. In Japan, for instance, formal titles and the seniority system are critical in a Japanese workplace. And that is why when it comes to the bowing, if you take a look at the picture here, one happens to be the senior in terms of rank than the other. You can see the obvious degree of bowing here. So the one who is slightly lower in terms of the bowing, the angle, that's what I'm referring to. The degree of angle here happens to be subordinate than the one whose head is higher or not that lowered, okay? Or at the same level with the other one who happens to be on the left side of this picture. So seniority can also be looked into this particular gesture. Now, the Japanese communication style is often indirect. Yep, trust me, I have tutored, I have talked to so many Japanese people before, and they are not always direct with what they mean. Why? Because if they say something and they mean it and they may commit an error with what they say, it may embarrass them. So they have to save face. They have to avoid destroying the reputation, if you got my point here. So that is why if you have heard of news or probably saw this on YouTube or TikTok, perhaps if a Japanese government employee or official created a mistake, he has to bow down and resign before everything escalates and his reputation is fully destroyed. So that's how Japan values their reputation as much as possible. Western companies doing business in Japan should be aware of the importance of formality, politeness, and the need for patience, of course. Now, it's a different case when it comes to a Western country like the US of A. Now, in contrast, American business communication is generally candid. And by the way, time is important to them. That's why they want you to be efficient when it comes to not only attending meetings on time, not in time, okay, by the way. In time means you're late, not on time, okay? And they value time, efficiency as much as possible. And when it comes to meetings, if the memorandum says this a meeting is going to take place for 30 minutes, the meeting should adjourn 30 minutes after. So there's no need to prolong everything because everyone considers their time to be gold. And of course, they don't want to waste their time on a meeting that is extended because resolutions have not been arrived at or achieved. So as much as possible, solutions should be attained within the 30-minute duration of the meeting. Foreign counterparts from high context cultures like Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, or Vietnam may feel rushed or misunderstood in these settings because most people, especially from Asia, they want to take their time. So sometimes in meetings, before going direct to your point or certain points or the agenda, some people would raise certain issues and then it would take a few minutes before these issues that have nothing to do with the agenda to be resolved. It's always the case. Now, another Western country at this time in Europe, say for example, France, what they have is somewhat interesting because it's a blend of high and low context cultural traits. And in this case, you have to study how French people also communicate with people outside of the culture. While the French can be formal and indirect, especially in hierarchical settings, they also value debate and directness in academic or intellectual discussions. So when a French student, say for example, a high school student, engages in a debate with you, whether you're older than him or much older perhaps than him, or maybe you're younger than him, it doesn't matter to that person. What matters to that French high school student is that your points make sense. Your ideas are logical when you are in a debate with him. So age does not matter at all. But he may also value your opinion. They're very open-minded too. French people are into politics and philosophy. So when you go to France, expect that people there don't talk most of the time, if not all the time, about personal lives of other people. rumors or gossips. They don't do that, by the way. They rather discuss anything that has something to do with philosophy and politics. Uh, that's one particular trait that would show to us that people in France happen to belong to a forward moving society. So that's all about high context and low context cultures. If you talk about in the case of workplace and business settings. I hope you have picked up important points from here, and with this would allow you to, well, finally get clarity on how you're going to achieve the resolution for your main challenge, especially on your major task for this week. Take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you around.